Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Wednesday, July 19th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 45 days. The game against Michigan in 129 days. When that Indiana game kicks off in 45 days, Ohio State's going to have a new starting quarterback. We do not officially know who that starting quarterback is going to be. Could be Devin Brown, could be Kyle McCord. Whoever it is, he will be a first-time, full-time starting quarterback. Kyle McCord, yes, did start the Akron game a couple years ago, but you know what we mean. First-time starting quarterback for Ohio State this fall. And I think everyone is sort of looking at that and saying, well, that's probably bad news because that a first-time starter, you don't have a sure thing coming back at quarterback. And the answer is not necessarily. Our good buddy Marcus Hartman from the Dayton Daily News just wrote about the history of first-time starting quarterbacks at Ohio State. I thought really some really interesting stuff in there. And I guess, Marcus, my first takeaway, and I think probably yours as well, was, boy, there are some better results than you'd expect from a guy who is a first-time starter for Ohio State.
Yeah, I sort of suspected. I knew there would be some good outcomes in general, just from recent history. When you look at it, I think looking at some of the older guys, I think the theme with some of the older guys was, even if they certainly didn't have the same kind of stats that current guys have, but they also, some of them about half of them still managed to be decent enough that the team around them, they still were able to win. And there was really nobody that was a complete disaster. Braxton Miller had some rough numbers, and some impressive numbers, but he also had, the worst situation, I think, by far around him, and he was still the Big Ten Freshman of the Year. So it's kind of like, it was interesting that some of the 90s guys, that managed to muddle through, there were more positives, honestly, from back then than not. Kind of what gave me the impetus for the story was, I realized there was maybe too much hand-wringing about Kyle McCord after the spring. Not to say that I guarantee he's going to be the All-Big Ten quarterback or anything like that. But, and Ryan Day did mention this, especially Fields. Justin Fields is pretty average, maybe even below average in the spring game. Dwayne Haskins was pretty raw in the spring game. He was okay. He had a couple of eye-popping throws. I actually missed, I don't remember because I had a conflict. I missed the, CJ Stroud. I missed the spring game in 21, but obviously nobody really jumped off the page in that game either. So, it's not like McCord threw 10 interceptions or anything. I mean, he was okay. Sometimes you're expecting to be wowed a little bit, but that's not necessarily what you're going to get. Certainly, if you look at I went back to 1988 and 1951. 1988, it was when there was a story in Buckeye Sports Bulletin that was literally titled, Jim Coletto brings modern passing game to Ohio State. Because in general, and depends who you talk to, but in general, there was very little straight drop back passing in even the Earl Bruce offenses in the 80s. Someone told me, one of the quarterbacks from back then said there was none, literally zero. They only went play action. I have had other people say that's not exactly true, but it still was a big change. This story from 1988, it was a big deal that they were going to sometimes have three receivers and sometimes get in the shotgun. So, that's kind of the break off for when I think you get to more of a modern passing game, with apologies to Jim Carsados and Tom Tupa and a couple of these other guys and Mike Tomczak, who obviously had good times as quarterbacks at Ohio State, but I had to cut it off somewhere. That's where I cut it off. And then the 51 cutoff is, that's an easy cutoff for a couple of reasons. One, it's kind of the Woody Hayes kind of brings in like the modern era of Ohio State football to a certain extent. But also, up until then, they still ran some single wing. So the quarterback is not the quarterback in the single wing. So it's much harder to compare apples and oranges from that standpoint, which, they had in 1950, they had the Heisman Trophy winner, and he was a single wing halfback. He was still on the team in 51, and he got about 1/3 as many yards and was kind of a nobody and did nothing because they switched full time to Woody Hayes' T offense. So anyway, yeah, to put I thought it was interesting. And it wasn't like it was just the last few guys have been really good, but it just sees kind of the ups and downs, that there's more good than bad in these years, even with different coaches.
Yeah, the defining the modern era of college football is always interesting because you can get the post-World War II kind of thing. You can get the post segregation, when the Southern teams finally got around to integrating in the early 70s. You can do that. You can do the BCS era. You can do the college football playoff era. It's always the modern age when you're starting, and sometimes the modern age involves coop towels and Jim Coletto running your offense and a 4-6-1 season, and sometimes it's a little more postmodern. Let's talk about the postmodern Ohio State era right now. That's obviously McCord and Brown, but you're also including the 2014 national championship, the 2002 national championship, and the interesting thing is, those are, I think everyone probably right now is thinking, oh yeah, those were 2 years when Ohio State had a new starting quarterback. And digging back through the data, you found that pretty much every time Ohio State wins a national championship, Ohio State has a new starting quarterback. So I guess, and that's true of Big Ten championship, wins over Michigan, all Big Ten quarterbacks. I mean, there is something about new starting quarterbacks that has brought out this, brings out these incredible results in Ohio State history to a point where it probably stops being a coincidence at some point. You can have the 1 year and it's the one weird year and you had the new start. But it's over and over and over again. So I guess real quickly, just run people through kind of what you found in terms of the correlation of first year quarterbacks and championships. And okay, the big question, why? Is this a coincidence, or is there some reason that Rex Kern did it his first year, and Greg Krenzel did it his first year, and JT Barrett did it his first year? Why does this keep happening?
Well, I mean, I think the number one answer is, even going back to the 50s, is that they usually have good players, pretty good teams. It's very little, and sometimes we forget that Urban Meyer, did improve the recruiting, but they took it from great to elite. I did the math. Back in the day, Jim Tressel's average recruiting class national rank was like 10. And then Urban Meyer upped it to like 5. So 10 is still pretty good. 10, I found at one time, was kind of the cutoff of if you were going to if you were going to win a BCS national championship. Basically, nobody lower than 10 did it. In the BCS era was when I added that up. So I'm not sure exactly how that correlates to playoff, but obviously it's a very similar situation. In terms of, so obviously they've had good rosters, even going back to the 50s. They won 2 national championships in the 50s. Obviously they had a good roster. So that's part of it. But they've had guys, sometimes I think that, so they've had some individually great quarterbacks too. But also I think sometimes when you have a guy that you don't know about, or if he's especially maybe kind of getting his feet wet early in the season, sometimes the rest of the roster will kind of pick themselves up too and maybe push a little bit. It's interesting, sometimes over the years we've seen teams fall back on the quarterback and make the quarterback carry too much of the load too. Well, that happens more when the quarterback is older and has more established himself. I mean, I think that's a pretty common theme as well. I think we saw that a lot in 21 with Stroud. We saw it in 14 with JT Barrett. Really that was a great team effort that it became a little more Barrett-centric as the season went on, and then obviously he got hurt, and that completely changed the script. So I would imagine that if there's some similarity with even going back to the Woody Hayes teams. The 68 team, I mean, there's no correlation to that team for multiple reasons. Because one thing, they couldn't play as freshmen, so they were all new, and that was just an individually incredible class. I mean, there's just all that. And Rex Kern was a great player. Rex Kern also, Ron Mason, he got banged up a lot. Ron Masajowski played a lot, all 3 years, and he started a handful of games and played a few times where he bailed them out, because Rex was hurt. And so, they had a lot of things going with them from that standpoint. And I did a story a long time ago that there were a lot of similarities between 14 and 68. One of them being that they had their starting quarterback returning, but he didn't end up being the starter, and they even had to play multiple quarterbacks. And also the 14 team, especially if you look at redshirt freshmen, had a lot of second-year guys who were big-time players on that team. So I think it's kind of interesting. If you look at the 90s, this is where it gets unique. Some of these guys ended up being, a lot of them, they all really ended up being good players for their careers, but 1993, it's pretty rough for Bobby Hoying. He had pretty good numbers for 1993. A first-year starting quarterback in 1993, he was pretty good. His numbers wouldn't stand out at all now, but they weren't bad. And he also had an assist because Brett Powers played regularly pretty much every game. But you even look at it, you go, well, That was decent. And then by 1995, he was one of the best quarterbacks that Ohio State had ever had up to that point. It's kind of the same thing. Even you look at, that's also where you look at the supporting cast. He had a better supporting cast than Kirk Herbstreit or Kent Graham. They didn't have a whole lot of help around them. And so the team was better. So the team did better, even with the quarterback kind of not necessarily being that locked in guy. But then these guys, as they got older, they get better. And the team, that's more of the progression in the 90s, and then you get into the 2000s, and these guys are a little bit more ready to hit the ground running. Craig Krenzel is kind of an interesting case as well. I ended up having him fifth. Where you get into, because those top four guys, they all won and they all had mind-blowing numbers. So, there's kind of the obvious top four, and then things get a little bit. There's more variables involved. I ended up with Craig Krenzel fifth because his team won the national championship, sure, but actually Craig Krenzel, if you look at it, his all-around numbers were probably better than you think. He was really a dual-threat quarterback for them. He ran for over 300 yards even after taking out sacks. He was the leading rusher in the national championship game, which was a unique game plan that game, and he still threw for 2,000 yards when it was no sure thing that an Ohio State quarterback was going to throw for 2,000 yards. They had 14 games, so that helped. But still, I look at with the kind of the intangibles put him over the top. That's why I slid C.J. Stroud, who obviously had a great individual season, but they didn't really win anything. He's the only guy I looked at of the top. So 8 of these freshman guys ended up in the top 15 single season, not freshmen, but first year starters ended up in the top 15 single season passing efficiency numbers, which obviously that is skewed towards the recent past, but there's still some good numbers from the more long ago. Well, CJ Stroud was the only one of those 8 guys who did not beat Michigan or win the Big Ten. That's not C.J. Stroud's fault entirely, but the other guys did manage to do maybe a thing or two here that you can argue that's kind of where it gets into how good does the quarterback have to be for you to get over the top. Even Terrell Pryor's team, Terrell Pryor had some rough moments in 2008, but they won the Big Ten, and they rallied from kind of a low point in the season and ended up winning, and he was an important part of the team, and obviously a good team around him, and that was something that they did not get done with Stroud. And there were some similarities there, I think, with Dwayne Haskins, because Dwayne Haskins, the offensive line was just okay. The running game was just okay. So he ended up setting a lot of individual numbers because he's really the only quarterback Ohio State has ever had that they leaned that heavily on his arm, especially on the quarterback that couldn't run. They leaned that heavily on some other guys like even Braxton Miller, but he ran a lot. It was all the quarterbacking of Haskins. So it's interesting just kind of seeing the way these guys got it done, what they got done, and then how it all stacked up.
And you've got the interesting. You mentioned all the stuff that was working against Dwayne Haskins, for example. You didn't mention the safety play that year or the defensive play that year, which I think you and I were both in West Lafayette, Indiana, when that defense put on its masterclass of what that defense looked like, and 90-something yard touchdowns against TCU and Penn State, like 2 of the longest touchdowns allowed in Ohio State history, given up in the span of, I think, 2 weeks that year. Once Nick Bosa went out, there was not a lot of defense on that team. So you mentioned the guys at the top of the list are sort of the guys you would expect. I think the interesting question now is just without knowing for sure who the starting quarterback is going to be, and without knowing, for sure how this season is going to play out, just looking at these surrounding casts, it feels like Kyle McCord and or Devin Brown, whoever that ends up being that starter this year, they probably have the supporting cast. Probably. We'll see how the offensive line shakes out, and we'll see how much improved the defense is. But they probably have the surrounding cast to be somewhere in that upper tier of the those rankings. Where would you think, where do you think those guys, whoever it ends up being, where do you think they end up on that list? Is there a chance this ends up being the greatest in history? Is there a chance this is just, is this a top 5 type team? What are you expecting? 12 months from now, you look back and you do this whole exercise again. Where do you think those guys maybe slot in, whoever that is?
I mean, the potential is definitely there to be the best, just because this probably is the best supporting cast. When you look at just how much production there is at receiver and running back, and they even have an experienced tight end, and his backups have played some. It's not like they're just throwing freshmen into the fire, unless Jelani Thurman ends up this firecracker that they can't keep off the field, which has its own positives if that is how it works out. I think that it's definitely got the potential to be the best. I mean, and Day said this in the spring. I mean, he doesn't need those guys to, win a bunch of games for him. I mean, really, when JT Barrett in 2014, a lot of those guys, those skill guys, we didn't know. Some of them ended up being good players. They hadn't done a whole lot up to that point, and they were not as good as the guys they've got now. And Carlos Hyde ended up being, when he was in 14, Ezekiel Elliott ended up being, a great player, although he was really just a guy until the second half of the season, even then. So you look at it, I mean, just in terms of what they've already done, and these are all very highly rated recruits, except for Mayan Williams, who, obviously is better than a 3-star player. The skill guys are probably the best that any of these first-year guys have had. The guys around Fields were very good. I don't know that they have the same production yet at that time in 2019. The offensive line was new in 19, but they were like all 5-star recruits. So, that's a little bit of a different dynamic there. But, I mean, they don't need that offensive line was one of the best they've had in a long time. So it doesn't have to be totally dominant when you look at it from that standpoint. Haskins, the crew around him was pretty good, and those guys were not too young. So that was a little bit different from that standpoint. So the ceiling is there, it is very, very high, which is another reason to kind of be bullish on them. They should not be in a case where they need the quarterback to just bail them out, unless it's because he has no protection and he's running for his life all the time, which even in that case, there are ways you can kind of avoid that, especially when it's not 3rd and long. So in terms of just being able to hand it off to guys who can take it the distance, who can break a couple of tackles, even, can turn a 3-yard gain into a 6-yard gain or a 6-yard gain into a 60-yard gain. And just as we know how good the top 2 receivers are already, and the depth is pretty good too, the tools are there if they just come out and they avoid mistakes. It should be pretty good. So I guess maybe this was partly this could be a little bit of a counseling session for Ohio State fans who are worried that Kyle McCord didn't just light it up in the spring game. First of all, that really doesn't preclude him from being really good in the fall. And second of all, again, as we've said all along, he doesn't have to be Dwayne Haskins as a first-year starter or Justin Fields as a first-year or second-year starter. Or, honestly, a lot fell on Stroud pretty early, too. Look at it. One of the things about that Oregon game in 21 was it was ridiculous how much they put on Stroud, given that it was his second start and all those things considered. You would think that Ryan Day perhaps learned from that and would try to avoid that kind of situation again this year, because it happened again. Some of the 3 worst offensive performances they had that year were all where they threw the ball too much. Same thing happened at Nebraska, and then obviously the Michigan game. There were a lot of things that happened there because they fell behind. So that I think kind of maybe that got them out of their comfort zone from that standpoint. But they were all games where too much fell on Stroud. As good as Stroud was, there was kind of too much on him. And then we saw the maximum CJ Stroud, where it was kind of all on him and he had it all working against Georgia, but that was his last start, after 2 full years. So it'll be up to the coaching staff to kind of try to avoid that. But if they can put the right amount on these guys' plate, and Devin Brown, we haven't seen, even in the spring game, but he's got the raw material to do it. It's just a matter of having the right mindset. I think you feel like Ryan Day, if there's something he knows how to do, it's how to coach up quarterbacks, even young quarterbacks. So you have to feel like there's a pretty good chance that the numbers will be fine. How will it translate to wins and losses? That's another. That's kind of the next thing where you look at. Because you can look at. If Haskins was actually a little better in that Purdue game, especially early on, they moved the ball. They just broke down in the red zone. They could have had a good-sized lead in that game at halftime, and instead they had like 7 points. Maybe they win that game. And the same thing you could say with Stroud. I mean, Stroud threw a couple of interceptions, if I recall, against Oregon. And I'm just saying, if C.J. Stroud were great. They could have won those games they lost. Now, that's asking a lot, but that's also kind of reality of the situation when you look at guys kind of rising to the occasion and when they can do that, and if they can do that as first-year guys. You kind of look at like J.T. Barrett's, his tour de force, his best performance was that Michigan State game in 2014, and he never topped that later on. And quite honestly, I didn't think he was quite that good as he was that game and against Minnesota, where it was really all on him. I mean, he was really more of a Justin Fields or a Braxton Miller for those games. The rest of his career, he was a little more of a distributor. The Penn State game in the fourth quarter, it all fell down on him and he made the plays. But the rest of the time, he was a little more of just a distributor, a guy who kind of kept the chains moving. So, you look at how all those things play out. How will it, I think that we know they'll have good numbers. Will they be there in the biggest moments, and what kind of support will they get in those moments?
Well, hopefully the whole conversation has made you feel a little bit better as Ohio State fans about what this fall could be with Ohio State having a first-time starting quarterback. I think the results were probably, the results of Marcus's deep dive on all this stuff was probably a little better than I think I expected, and probably a lot of people at home expected. Marcus, you just published the story on this whole thing, so if people want to read that and perhaps make themselves feel any better, print it out, put it on the refrigerator, just to, as a little bit of... just a, affirmation every morning that life might be okay for Ohio State fans this fall. Where can they find that? Where can they find you on Twitter?
Oh, you can find it. You can find me just at Marcus Hartman on Twitter, DaytonDailyNews.com, SpringfieldNewsSun.com, and JournalNews.com all have that. And I did in one of the stories, I ranked them in one story. In another, I just put general kind of things to know about when they've had a first-year quarterback. I did put all the stats for those guys in there, so you can actually get into that story and kind of investigate it for yourself, because I ranked them all, and I think there's some obvious tiers at the top and the bottom, and it gets a little bit different in the inside where you've got some guys who had a little bit better stats, but maybe the team was a little bit better. Again, I guess one of the overall takeaways was there were fewer clunkers even really than I would have thought of, and even the guys who at the bottom of the list weren't just absolutely terrible, and a couple of them had no help at all. In 1988 was maybe the worst roster Ohio State's had in like 100 years, or who knows, or since like 1943 when everybody was in Germany and Japan, and so and that was, and Greg Fry also was a kind of, Greg, you look at like Greg Fry and Bobby Hoying. And those are guys, and Stanley Jackson a little bit. Those are guys that all, they were maybe okay when they were young, and then they grew into like very effective players. The main difference now in the last 7 or 8 years is these guys are very effective when they're freshmen. Still a matter of what happens when the rubber meets the road in some of the big moments, but it's kind of interesting to know that it's not completely new that Ohio State still gets pretty good play from first-year starting quarterbacks.
Yeah, so that'll be something we will be keeping an eye on all fall. And we're going to be keeping an eye on that starting next week as well with Big Ten Media Days. Marcus, I think, is going to be there along with Kevin and Tony and I in Indianapolis talking sort of the unofficial start of college football season. That'll be a lot of fun. So we'll have full coverage of that. You can look forward to that for next week. But in the meantime, you can feel a little bit better about where Ohio State may end up this fall. So hopefully this has lifted your spirits a little bit, the beleaguered Ohio State fan. And we will talk to you guys tomorrow.